You forgot to take some.
My girlfriend was getting everything done at once, and I keep in mind that we have
Oh, that's what I'm saying. I shouted over these guys, and I gotta say, by the end of Okay, I think we're going to get started here. Yeah. Welcome to this evening's installment of English at the Pub. Here, of course, we build upon the cafe culture, growing both internationally and nationally, both to bring original research in the humanities out of the classroom and into the public sphere, and, of course, also to raise money for literacy programs in and around Brookings, because in today's climate, by God, somebody's got to. So, to that end, we'll circulate a jar around for your donations as the talk goes on. And make no mistake, no donation is too big or too small. And if you positively loathe the idea of supporting literacy, no pressure. We've got just a couple of announcements before we get started, and as always, they begin with thank you. First of all, to Don and Mary from Gin's for letting us use their space, without whom this would not be possible. And to Ion for putting together the complimentary food for tonight's gatherings. There are snacks in the back, but of course, party up front. And to Bob and Cindy for lending us their equipment so that you can hear us. Now, for those of you who heard about this from a friend or whatever, as opposed to through some electronic means, there are a couple of ways you can learn about further lectures of English at the Pub, and one of which is a sign-up sheet that we're going to circulate. We have an email group that we send out reminders to. We do this once a month, the second Thursday of every month. So if you're not already on the list, be sure to sign up. The second, we have a Facebook group that is cunningly named English at the Pub. So you can track us down there. Now, tonight, I'm delighted to introduce tonight's speaker, my colleague, collaborator, my great good friend, Dr. Stefan Hall. He got his BA in English from Austin Peay State University and his MA and PhD in medieval literature from St. Louis University. Go Billikens.
Whatever that is.
Yeah, yeah, it looks like Buddha.
Or a Dr. Seuss character.
Or Paul Acker. Yeah, we can talk about him. He's currently an associate professor of humanities and English at the University of Wisconsin-Green Bay, and his wide-ranging research interests include Old English, Old Norse, Middle English, and as you'll hear tonight, medieval Scots literature. He is also a reader for Scottish Historical Review. Tonight his paper is entitled Medieval Scotland, National Identity in John Barbour's Bruce. Please help me welcome Dr. Stefan.
So let's test this microphone. Yeah, that's good. I'm actually kind of a loud mouth to begin with, but my voice is kind of suffering this week a little bit. I'm not sure what from. Thanks to Mick Nagy there, I won't call him one of my oldest friends because he's not that old, but a little bit older than me. I've been coming actually to South Dakota pretty much as long as Mick and Diane have lived here, so I've been in this pub many times before, but never to actually talk about something that I'm working on scholarly-wise. So I've been working on medieval Scottish stuff for a long, long time, and I actually have some notes and things. I usually don't look at them, but I think I will a little bit tonight. So one of the things that I like to talk about when I talk about medieval Scotland is the idea of national identity. And we all know that Scotland has a very distinctive national identity today, right? So when you think of Scotland, you think of the flag. So there's one actually flying back there. That's the Lion Rampant flag. And we'll look at that here in a minute. That was actually Robert the Bruce's flag. It was his standard. This is the St. Andrew's Cross. Most European countries will have a cross or a three-color, and then you get the weirdos like the Welsh and they have a dragon on theirs, right? Or the Scots with a lion on one of their flags. And there's an argument on which flag is the official flag. This one usually gets shown, but you go to pretty much any Scottish castle, any Scottish official thing in Scotland, and then they're both flying there. So they're proud of both of them. Lots of color. But Scotland has a very distinctive national identity today. How many of you guys know about kilts? Right? Everybody wears a kilt. Mick asked me to wear my kilt today, and I thought, man, I got to drive, I don't know, 8.5 hours to get here. It's going to be kind of itchy by the time I get here, so I didn't wear my kilt today. I do have kind of a shot of it on the cover of my book from like 10 years ago. Actually, sorry. This is a pub, right? That's a crotch shot. Just because that's this one, right down the front. Right? Yeah, sexy, exactly. How many of you guys have eaten haggis? Oh, haggis is wonderful, wonderful. Yeah. Especially for breakfast, it's better than corned beef hash, if you ask me. It's nice and spicy. It goes really well with some running eggs. I'm trying to gross Marissa out here. So haggis, kilts. What else do you know about? Bagpipes. Holy crap! Yeah, can't leave out the bagpipes. Those things are awful. Other people have played bagpipes and whatnot throughout history. And only the Scots have had the tolerance, I guess, or the hardiness to endure those things. Because when they're out of tune, oh dear God, they sound like an animal dying, right? So we've got these sorts of things. What else do you think of? Well, you got the bagpipes, you got haggis, you got Sean Connery. Exactly. Oh, and whiskey. Right? And if you spell it right, is it with an EY or with a Y? I'm not sure. And if you call somebody Scotch and they're actually Scottish, they say no, Scotch is actually a whiskey. Let's see if I've got it. Where is it? Where's the guy? Oh, hang on, he's back here. There he is. So this is typically what you think of. I've even got my Jimmy hat. I threatened to wear for the entire performance here. This is great. I like a microphone. These things are ridiculous. They wear them to the football matches. There you go. So, this thing I go. So you get the ginger hair, and of course that's another stereotype. All Scots are ginger haired. Actually, I did see a few redheads in Scotland this summer, last summer, but not too many. So, It's just kind of a part of the national identity as well. You might be surprised, however, to find that a lot of these things that we associate with the modern sort of Scottish national identity are rather recent inventions, right? So some of you guys have plaid on, and people think of, oh, Scotch plaid, right? There you go. You even get it on the, the Scotch tape. You get the lineage, and it's got the plaid on the packing and whatnot. Those sort of registered tartans, everybody has their own family tartan. The Halls actually don't have a family tartan. We have to wear either one of the clans that we're associated with. I actually wear, I can wear one of a multiple, like McCrae's, that was my grandmother's name, Fletcher's, the Arrow Makers, right? I could wear that one. On the cover of my book, I'm not trying to plug this. If you want a copy, let me know. I'll send it to you for free. I mean, seriously. I think this thing costs like $100, and that's just way too much for the amount of effort I put into it. So if you actually want it, I'll send it to you electronically. Just send me an email. But this was the national tartan, and people say, well, the national tartan of Scotland, that must be very ancient. And I say, no, it was actually introduced in 1994. So there you go. Yeah. Looking at my notes, I mean, there's kind of a cynical view that we could take of Scottish national identity, the modern national identity. Anyway, we could say that it's fabricated. The kilt was actually introduced by an Englishman to his Highland workers. The Highlanders would often wear not this kind of thing, which is like a skirt with a belt at the waist. They would wear like this big blanket thing that they wrapped around them several times, right? With a shirt, a tunic or something like that. They could sleep in it at night, that sort of thing. But when they started working in the factory that this Englishman had set up in Inverness, they got caught up in the machinery and workers were dying. And so the English, the Englishman who was running this factory said, what are we going to do about this? And he said, well, sir, it's because they wear the giant fellowback thing they work, right? And so the Englishman said, well, why don't we just do this? Bring me one of these guys. And he just takes some scissors and he cuts it right off and puts a thing, and he says, there you go. And so that won't get caught up in the machinery. So there you have a kilt, right? Where did the tartan come in? All these family-specific tartans. This one's like the Stuart tartan. You've probably seen the Black Watch tartan. I mean, the Gordons have a tartan, the Gordon Highlanders. Actually, see, I'm naming off sort of the big ones. But every little family has one now. You can go and there's like hundreds and hundreds of registered tartans, and they register new ones every year. So I think even Hong Kong has a tartan. No, I'm not kidding, right? And you can buy it in a shop, according to Jim Malcolm, one of my favorite folk singers, in a shop in the Kyle of Loch Alsh. You can buy a Hong Kong tartan. What the hell is that? So there's a tartan for basically anyone who wants to wear one. There's a Canadian tartan. It's one of my favorites. It's beautiful. There's one called the Maple Leaf tartan, and I bought that a long time ago. I wanted a tie, and it's a beautiful tartan. Where did all of these things come from? Well, you heard me mention the Black Watch. After the uprising, the Jacobite uprising against the English, the English started to employ Scots to watch after other Scots. They actually had Scottish regiments in the military, one of which was the Black Watch, and they gave them a specific uniform to wear. That happened to be the Black Watch tartan. The Royal Steward, that was worn just by the royal family. You also had the Gordon Highlanders. They had a specific tartan that they wore. So in some sense, it was a military uniform. And then the proliferation of registering your family's ancient tartan came about. If you've ever seen the movie Braveheart, I said I wasn't going to mention this, but if you've ever seen it, all of the folks hanging out with William Wallace are wearing the exact same tartan, and you got Douglases hanging out with Stuarts, hanging out with Wallaces and whatnot, because you wore whatever the local weaver was weaving, right? There wasn't a family-specific tartan. There might be a clan-specific tartan because enough people in one clan were going to the same weaver. All right, so we dispelled a couple of things there. Bagpipes, oh God, they're all over Europe. The Romans apparently had bagpipes, and they thought better of it after a while and just stuck with horns and drums and whatnot. The Irish had the one, actually the Irish had a good one. You can plug it up and just kind of do this, and you don't have to blow on it all night. So you can actually smoke while you're playing it. It's great. So the bagpipes weren't specifically a Scottish instrument either. And then you get, what did I say, haggis? Oh, please. People around the world are stuffing stuff into sheep's intestines and stomachs and whatnot and making sausages out of it. The Scots just have it. Now, I love sausage, right? But why do you have to boil it? The Scots boil haggis. It's a pudding, actually. I mean, they call it the great, Burns called it the great chieftain of the pudding race, right? So it was actually, and it's kind of like a small football. They taste great and it's fantastic. But it's not particularly Scottish. People do this stuff all over the world. So, what could we say Scottish national identity is? We could, like I say, the cynical view is that this is all something made up. They made this up. And we could say that this is a very recent phenomenon, but that would be a lie. Because in the Middle Ages, they were making shit up too. In fact, most of the historical writings from the Middle Ages about Scotland, talking about how great the Scots were and how awful the English were, basically make the stories up. I'm not going to say that it's complete fiction, but as Professor Nagy and I were talking about a little while ago, history is basically a story. It's a fiction. And after that, maybe it's got actual historical figures, historical characters, people who really existed instead of people who were made up. But beyond the name and beyond the fact that they were actually alive, history in some sense, and I know there are probably some historians in here and I'm pissing them off, but history is a story. It's a fiction. During the 14th century, the period that I love to study the most, the Scottish historians and the Scottish poets were kind of at a war, just like the actual warriors were at war, with English historians and French historians. And they were trying to write their version of the narrative. And so if you think about that for a second, the battle, the war, is not just on the battlefield, people trying to kill each other and win territory. The war is also to, in some sense, claim the truth, or claim the actual version of it. And what we have in the 14th century in England and Scotland are tons and tons of different versions of the same things. And so one of the versions that I wanted to talk about tonight, which doesn't get talked about quite as much as the whole William Wallace and freedom and all of that crap, is John Barbour's Bruce. John Barbour was a contemporary, really, of Chaucer's. So if anybody's read the Canterbury Tales and you know how brilliant Chaucer was, you'd be surprised to find that there was somebody in Scotland who wrote a wonderful poem. Actually, let's see if I can click on my outline here. John Barbour, 1325 to 1395, that's roughly Chaucer's dates. I think Chaucer was 1330 to 1400. It's about the same. But, he wrote a 13,646 line poem. Now, I'm sorry. I can't even write a sonnet and get it to rhyme. And he divided it into books and everything. And it tells the history of Robert the Bruce and how he became King of Scotland. But it doesn't stop there, and that's the best part. It's not just a history of the king, because that you might point the finger at him and say, wow, are you just telling a story to make the King of Scotland sound really good because you're working for his grandson or something like that, and you just want to get paid. He doesn't stop at just praising the Bruce, and hopefully as I talk a little bit more tonight and you get to see, Barbour actually praises commoners who helped the Bruce take castles. And okay, it's not going to devolve, I promise, into me showing you pictures from my vacation last year. But there's some cool castles. And actually, the pictures will, you look at it and go, whoa, that's a big castle. Yeah. They were actually taken with the help of commoners who get their names in the book. Now, that's the coolest part about this, the fact that these people get their names in the history book, so to speak. People who were like guys who worked in a mill and stuff, but who joined up with Robert the Bruce in his effort to win the country back from the English. They got their names in the book. We're going to get to see some of them. Barbour doesn't stop there as well. Once Bruce dies, we'll get to hear a little bit about... I told this to my students the other day, and they were horrified, but we were talking about pilgrimage. And Bruce never got to go on pilgrimage in his life. And so he goes to his best friend right as he's dying, James Douglas, and he says to Douglas, I want to go on pilgrimage, but I can't. I'm dying. He died of leprosy, which was thought to be a sexually transmitted disease. That doesn't make it into Barbour's poem, by the way. And so as he's dying, he tells Douglas, I want to go on pilgrimage, but I can't go. Will you take my heart to Jerusalem? And Douglas, being the sort of ruthless dude that he was, said, I will. And so that when Bruce died, they cut his heart out and gave it to James Douglas. And James Douglas put it in a little metal casket, heart-shaped, wore it around his neck, and headed off for the Holy Land. I'm not making this up. This is true. And he got as far as Spain and got in a fight with some invading Islamic forces. And he actually, at one point, this is sort of what we would call Monty Python and the Holy Grail moment. He saw some of his buddies in trouble. They were kind of cut off from the rest of the army. And he takes the Bruce's heart in this little metal casket, and he, like a holy hand grenade, throws it into the middle of all of these people, and they're so freaked out because this is they don't know what it is, right? And so they kind of scatter left, right, and center, and in comes Douglas, probably shouting something like "freedom" or something like that, and starts killing people. Well, he himself actually gets killed, and they couldn't figure out. He was a big man. They couldn't figure out how to get his body back home. They recovered the Bruce's heart, and so my students just hated this, but they boiled the Douglas down to nothing but his bones, and they took his bones back because, well, I mean, you can do that. I mean, think about it. Think about boiling somebody down to nothing but their bones, right? They boiled all the other stuff. They rendered him, and they took his bones, and they took the Bruce's heart in his casket back to Scotland and buried him. And I got to actually see the site where they buried Bruce's heart last summer. So I'll show you my picture of me looking at it very longingly and reflective. But the interesting part about John Barbour, he does amplify the Bruce. He doesn't tell you about all of the Bruce's faults. He doesn't tell you, he in fact completely downplays the fact that Bruce was loyal at one point to Edward I of England. He doesn't mention that at all in the poem. His version of how Bruce becomes king really emphasizes, his kingly qualities, his martial prowess, how smart he was, all of this kind of stuff. And it downplays the sort of negatives. But the best part about it is it's not just a focus on the king, it's a focus on the people of Scotland. And not just King Robert, but also the barons like James Douglas, who were loyal to King Robert, and the commoners who were a part of this fight. In my dissertation, and later I revised it for my book, there was actually even a section where the women help out. So Barbour was very inclusive. Some of the medieval stories that you might read are all about kings and queens and knights and nobles, and you don't get to hear about common people. But Barbour was one of the first historians, if you want to call him that. He didn't call his book a history, he called it a romance. And yet it is historically accurate for the most part, apart from the things that he leaves out and maybe accents a little bit more. But he's one of the first to actually start to include the names of commoners. So we'll look. Now, I don't want to bore the crap out of you with a big long timeline, but I've got a big long timeline, and I figured I would just kind of scroll through it. Anybody in here know the history of the wars between the English and the Scots at all? You heard about it before? I know you probably saw Braveheart, and they got like two things right. And one of them was that William Wallace yelled, "Freedom!" Right? That's it, right? Actually, the word freedom was on their lips back then, and they seemed to have a pretty well-defined sense of what freedom was. But the main problem was that Scotland's king, Alexander III of Scotland, died without an heir. He died. This was the weird part about it. He and his wife, his new wife, they were at different places. He was at a party, and she was up the coast, and apparently he gets a letter from her saying she's ready for him. And he got all excited, and he's like, "All right, guys, I'll see you." And they're like, "No!" And because this is the king of Scotland, he rides off by himself on a horse, and he falls off a cliff. So, what do you do? Well, they had about 6 or 7 different people who had really, really good claims. I mean, they're like, "Well, I'm related to so-and-so, I'm related to so-and-so." So some of those scenes in Braveheart are actually kind of accurate, where you have people saying, "I've got documents, right? This says that I'm the closest relative and whatnot." What they wound up doing, and this was the stupidest thing in the whole world, I don't know why they did it, they invited Edward I of England to come and arbitrate between the various claims. And Edward I basically came in and kind of said, well, why don't I just be your king? Actually, at first, it's a little more complicated than that. He was trying to marry his son off to Margaret, the maid of Norway. He also tried to appoint a guy named John Balliol for a while, who was loyal to Edward. There was quite a few options that he had. Edward I also, he actually asked John Balliol, who he had appointed as King John of Scotland, to send some troops at one point to fight against the French. And of course, as your feudal duty, if you're working for a king and the king says, I want to go and kick my neighbor's butt, you have to send troops. And preferably, you got to show up and lead your troops. And Balliol said, no, I'm not going to do that. So Edward then decides, well, we'll just invade Scotland, and I'll become king because Balliol's not doing what I'm telling him to. So, if you notice, there's a war with England. It starts around 1296, and this is a knockdown, drag-out kind of war. In fact, Edward I, his troops were pretty good. They had been well-trained. They were fighting in France. They were fighting... and, of course, in 1297, this is the famous victory with William Wallace and some guy named Andrew Murray. Y'all are supposed to laugh, right? Isn't that a tennis player, or did I get that wrong? I think the guy's name's Andrew Murray. Andy Murray, right? Come on, right? Yeah. No, but I'm not making this up. This guy shows up, and he gets killed at that battle, and he was the noble lord who was in charge, and Wallace was kind of like second in command, kind of one of the field generals. And since Murray gets killed, Wallace gets all the credit and becomes the sole guardian of Scotland. They're all like, yes, we want Wallace for our guardian, not king, right? So interestingly enough, Wallace has quite a bit of success there for a very short period of time. You'll notice how quickly this goes. Wallace is executed in 1305. He didn't get the support, probably because he was not a noble. Bruce's grandfather and father both put in claims to the throne as well, but it's the Bruce, Robert the Bruce, who finally becomes king. And it's a really interesting sort of story about how this comes about. I'm trying to get all this on the screen. If you can't see it, don't worry, I'm going to talk about it anyway. So, I'm sorry about the sore throat here. But Bruce, he actually murdered his rival. They had made a pact with one another. Yeah, here, I'll get one. I'll get a beer.
You want water?
No. I hear they make this with water. At least I put water in the batches that I drink. Let's see. So they had made a pact with one another. Bruce and Comyn, and there were different branches of the Comyn family. This was the Red Comyn. They had made a deal with one another, and Comyn actually says to Bruce, and this appears only in Barbour. Some of the other versions just say that Barbour killed his nearest rival. But in Barbour, he said that Bruce and Comyn got together and had an agreement. And Comyn says, okay, I will help you become king, right? And you'll give me lots of lands in return. Or else, you can help me become king, and I'll give you lots of lands in return. You'll be my second in command. And Bruce says, all right, you can help me. We'll become king. And they signed an actual piece of paper, or parchment at the time. They signed it, and it was a duplicate, both sides. And then they ripped it down the middle with the seal on it and everything. So this was official. This was in days before photocopiers and stuff like that, right? So, days before they had, But anyway, so here it is. They both got a copy. And Comyn immediately goes to Edward I and hands it over and says, this is what Bruce has asked me to do. Holy crap. Now, this is the best part about it. Edward I summons Robert the Bruce to him and says, WTF? What's this for? Okay, now that's what I'm not making it up. I actually thought that's what it meant. And I said that in class, and my students were like, no, it means, I'm like, I know now, but WTF, what's this for? And Bruce looks at it and says, I've never seen that before in my life. Not a clue what you're talking about here. And interestingly enough, he buys a little bit of time. He says, that doesn't look quite like my seal. And Edward says, well, produce your seal and we'll compare them. And Bruce says, it's back at the hotel. Right? So he pops back to the hotel, grabs up all of his stuff, including his seal, and hightails it back for Scotland, and meets up with the Red Comyn and murders him in church. They met up, they were sitting there at the altar, and Bruce says, WTF? What's this for? Come on, man. And the Red Comyn looks at him and says, I don't know what you're talking about, and Bruce stabbed him. Right there, at the altar. Now, this is excommunicable offense, right? For which he was excommunicated, right? But he walks out and he's got this dagger in his hand. He's bloody up to here, and his men who had been, it was just the Bruce and the Comyn in the church. And he walks out and he actually says, this is the tradition, the later tradition. He says, they say, what'd you do? He says, dude, I've killed the Red Comyn. And the one guy says, do you do? Oh my, sick of him. And he goes in and they stab him another 40 times. Right? So anyway, so I'll make sure he goes back in, and his other guys they stab him. And at this point, Bruce has himself crowned king, but he's by no means popular amongst all of the Scots. In fact, in Barbour's Bruce, people who fight against the Bruce are considered English, even if they're Scottish. Because they're fighting for the English. So English and Scottish as terms in the Bruce at some points just become sort of more like political alliances. If you're fighting with Robert the Bruce against the English, you are Scottish. And a good example of this is Bruce's nephew, his name Thomas Randolph, and he was fighting for the English, but he gets captured and joins up with Robert the Bruce, and Bruce then he's referred to as Scottish after that. So it's kind of interesting. Your political alliance was actually sort of your national identity, at least for a while in there. But notice that Bruce's army eventually does, by 1314, after many setbacks on the timeline, they actually do defeat Edward II's army. And we're going to talk about this. What happened to Edward I? Well, in Braveheart, he dies like coughing up a lung, right? And the future Queen of England comes over and says, ha ha ha, I slept with William Wallace, right? And then he dies like coughing up a lung, right? And she gets to laugh. Because in the movie, right, William Wallace sleeps with, whatever her name, Isabel, right, from France, and right, that didn't happen. They weren't together. So this is interesting that Mel Gibson wants to really romanticize this and make it seem like he's ripping off a guy named Wallace who actually wrote this, but make it seem like that the next king, Edward III of England, was actually William Wallace's son. Didn't happen. If you look at the timeline, Wallace was dead before Isabella actually even got to the country. But so that's one of the big fibs of the whole movie. One of the other big fibs of the movie, and this actually shows up in, I'll even show it to you, Blind Harry's book called The Wallace, which was the late 15th century, about 100 years after Barbour, was that Bruce and Wallace actually got to talk to one another. And that it was Wallace's urging of Bruce to switch his loyalties from Edward I to Scotland that made it possible for Bruce to then become king. Never happened. Once again, the time is just wrong. I mean, they might have had a chance. Wallace might have had a chance to meet Robert the Bruce's father, but probably not young Robert. So we have to look to Barbour, John Barbour, the 14th century author, who is writing during, the last year or so. He was born about the last year of Robert the Bruce's lifetime. He was writing during a time of Robert II's rule, and so this was, the Bruce's grandson, and he would have wanted to impress him. He actually, we do have a sense, at least in terms of his, I know, look at that timeline, sorry, are you bored already? That we do actually have right here, and I know this doesn't sound like a whole lot, but Robert II actually paid Barbour 10 pounds from the customs in 1377 for probably writing the Bruce, because that's about when the poem was written, which is pretty interesting. You'll also notice that John Barbour's career, he's born in 1319 or 1320, 1325, somewhere in there, but he becomes the Archdeacon of Aberdeen. He goes off and studies in Oxford for a couple of years, but he doesn't take a degree. He just goes and studies. He had a chance to consult, lots and lots of historical records. He also went all the way down to Saint-Denis in Paris. I mean, this guy was super educated. And when he comes back to Aberdeen in the mid-1370s, it's pretty clear that this 13,000 some odd line poem is ready to come into being. I mean, he's ready to write it. And he presents it to the king and his court, and he gets paid 10 pounds for it. And I bet he was really, really chuffed. 10 pounds. Yeah.
That was an enormous amount of money.
Absolutely, yeah. A nobleman's income at that time in Scotland would have probably been no more than maybe triple that. So for one book, to get paid 10 pounds, holy crap. It was like a third of a nobleman's income for one book. Now, I would like to get that for one book. I would write more books. I don't know what the equivalent of that would be nowadays. A couple $100,000 for a book. I'm not writing the right kind of books. I'm writing, academic books don't pay. So, but you'll notice then, and I did this just for the sake of seeing what he might have studied at Oxford or at Saint-Denis in terms of written sources, and there's a pile. I mean, Barbour might have known. Look at this list of historical sources. And they're from all over. Some of them are French. Barbour would have known French. Some of them were English. Barbour would have definitely known English. He wrote in English. Some people will say he wrote in Scots, but it was just Scottish dialect. The other, he would have known how to read Latin. He can actually, everybody who's educated at the time knew how to read Latin. He was Archdeacon of Aberdeen, so he would have been able to read the Latin sources as well. So the big three languages there, English, French, and Latin, Barbour would have been well versed in, and maybe even others, not sure. Chaucer was clearly well versed in, say, Italian as well, because he rips off Boccaccio all the time. So who knows whether Barbour picked up another language during the time. But just with English, French, and Latin sources, we can look at this. The Chronicle of Pierre de Langtoft, that was actually written in Latin, I believe, right? Gray's Scala Chronica, Brutus, and then you'll see actually the coverage of these histories go from all the way back when Aeneas' grandson supposedly founded the Isle of Britain and called it, his name was Brutus, so he called it Britain. That's funny. I'm sorry. But that was common kind of conception in 14th century England. Edward III, who thought he was King Arthur reincarnated or something, had the whole history traced all the way back to Brutus, Aeneas' grandson, so that the Britons, not the English, mind you, that's the weird part about it. I mean, if the English are trying to write, English national history, they're actually tracing their roots to the Britons, and they're claiming Arthur as an Englishman. He wasn't. He was Welsh. Anyway, so I'm sorry if I'm making fun of English people too much tonight. You'll have to just I'll make my apologies right now because I'm here to talk about Scottish people. Anyway, so you'll notice whoa, that's bad. You'll notice though that we have French works like Jean Lebel, his Chronique. We have Latin works like the Vita, or Vita, as they would say, Edwardi Secundi, the life of Edward II. We have Robert of Reading's Flores Historianum, the flowers of history kind of thing. St. Albans Chronicle, Brut, Lanarkos. And that one's actually quite a good one because it's a northern work. So Barbour would have had a chance to read all of these written sources to base his historical work on. It is a poem. He doesn't call it a history. He calls it a romance. But he would have had this amount of historical written work to work with. John of Fordon was one of his colleagues there at Aberdeen too, and he wrote a fantastic history. that was later augmented. So there's piles of written sources that Barbour may have used, but what I would actually like to suggest, and I'm going to skip some things, was that Barbour actually used a lot of oral sources. He says over 30 times in his 13,000-line poem that he heard something, that he heard a story. And you kind of got to wonder if he's just trying to fill in a line every now and then, because sometimes they'll do that. They need something that rhymes with say, like play. And I said, and it was a battle full of hard play, as I heard say, and it rhymes. But a lot of times when Barbour tells you, I heard something, it turns out to be some sort of folkloric story. This is the best edition of the Bruce. Notice how thick it is. That's because it's dual language. And Barbour's language is actually kind of difficult. If you're used to reading Chaucer and you get to read this, it's a little difficult to read. You get used to it pretty quickly, and then, so, whenever I teach this, I make my students read from the side where all of the good stuff is, but they start out reading over here, and then they eventually sort of shift over, because it's not that difficult. It is difficult if you're not willing to listen, and I tell my students to read this stuff out loud. But one of the stories that Barbour heard is often depicted in medieval manuscripts of Bruce, and it's it's the very start of the Battle of Bannockburn. This was the big victory for Bruce, and Bruce apparently strikes the first blow. He sees this guy, Henry de Bohun, that's Bohun, that's the way they pronounced it, and he rides out, and he sees the guy advancing on him. The guy thinks, that's Bruce, I'm going to get him. And apparently Bruce, without a helmet, all he has is like his circular crown. He comes out with his axe and just buries it in Boone's head. And all of his dudes who were like talking and trying to figure out, whether they had time to take a pee before the battle started, look over and their king has buried an axe in one of the other noblemen's heads, and it's sort of like that was the first blow at Bannockburn. Now, I don't know if this is true or not, but it's what Barbour tells us he heard happened. Once again, he wasn't alive, he wasn't at that battle, but he could have had the opportunity. He was within a generation of King Robert. He knew families, he knew people, and probably did quite a few interviews of people who had fought with Bruce. So interestingly enough, this was one of the first things that really caught my attention because it was on the cover. So you get, thick book, lots of footnotes, wonderful read because you only have to read half of it. That's the best one. Like my students look at it and go, I can't read 100 pages. I'm like, oh, they're really 50. And then also notice that it's poetry, so it only goes part way across, and then they get there's a lot of blank space on the pages. You're like reading a third of the pages. But just to give you an idea of Barbour's language, I'd like to read a little bit. It's kind of nice. He was a great poet in his own right. I mean, some people think Chaucer. They think the Gawain poet, and those are great poets. But the Scots actually had some good poets as well. And if you read it with sort of the 14th century pronunciation, it might strain your comprehension just a little bit. But you do have a translation over here, so you can check it out. But you'll notice the Scots say things slightly differently than the English would. So this would be, this is like peeking back a little bit too much. This would be Sir Henry the Bohun, the worthy, that was weak, peaked, and hardy, and told the Earl of Hereford, cousin, armet and armest, good and fien, come on a stay the bow shot near, before all other that they were, and knew the king, for that he saw him swaring his men on raw, and by the crown that was set also upon his bassinet, and toward him he went, and when the king swa apertly saw him come forth, all his fairest, and he till him the horsey stairest. And when Sir Henry saw the king come on forut in a basin, till him he rade in full great heat, he thought that he should well lichtly win him, and have him at his will, sin he him horsed saw ill. Now, remember, Bruce has only got a crown. He didn't have the whole helmet on. So some of these pictures where you see, like in this manuscript, we see Bruce with an entire helmet on. Right? The only reason why Sir Henry actually recognized him is he just got this round crown on, and it was a very plain crown. It wasn't some kind of fancy something. But he saw him, and he spurs his horse, and Bruce sees him, and he spurs his horse. And so they keep going. And this is great. So I'll skip down to this a little bit. Yeah, here you go. So I'm just going to highlight it so I can see it from here. Sir Henry, right? Misseth the noble king. So they come out, and y'all have seen people joust, right? I have no idea how they do this. They got these helmets, and they're looking at these little slits, and they're trying to, right? I would fall on my butt. But these guys practice this, right? So, but he missed the noble king. Perhaps Bruce is really, really awesome at this. And hey, that in his stirrup stood, with the axe that was hard and good, with swa great mane rocked him a dent, that nother hat, not helm, make stent. The heavy douche that hay him gave, that ne'er the heed till the harness clave. So Bruce stands up. I guess, I don't know, maybe this was part of why Henry missed him. He stands up in his stirrups, and he takes his axe, and he drives it in his head, and apparently cleaves the head in half. Holy shit. So like I say, this makes it onto, like, you know, the cover of a book. This sort of scene which Barbour has heard. I wish I could show you this one. You can come up and look at it afterwards. But there's Boone with his head's not cut in half, at least on this bit. But not yet, maybe. I mean, it's still in progress. One of the things that Barbour tries to do with scenes like this, things that he has heard, maybe perhaps from people, but one of the things that he's trying to do is give you a portrait of a king who kicks ass. We know that Bruce had some health issues. We know that he died of leprosy. We know that, you know, well, then he had his heart taken. He wasn't even able to go on pilgrimage. We know that every now and then he was not able to come out and fight with his men, and the Scots actually suffered because of that. The health of the king kind of parallels the health of the army and the health of the nation. And it wasn't until sort of Bannockburn where Bruce kicks butt that people are like, okay, now we got a real hardy king. We can follow this guy. So Barbour's trying to portray sort of the healthy King Robert, this guy who can cut somebody's head in half through a helmet with an axe, just while standing up and doing that. Someone who can evade a lance blow or a sword blow. This is supposed to make you feel really confident in your king. And it's also, once again, don't forget, to impress his grandson for whom you're writing and you want to get 10 pounds for your book, right? So, but the interesting part about this is that Barbour says he heard this. The other thing that I would like to point out, and if I can find this in my, I know y'all are looking at this going, holy crap, look at all that text he's got. It's a 13,000-something line poem. I'm giving you just excerpts from it. But the other thing that Barbour wants to point out is not just that Robert the Bruce kicked ass at the Battle of Bannockburn, but that commoners did as well. So, this is interesting, because how many of y'all have heard of Chaucer's Yeoman? It's a great name, isn't it, right? Yo, man, right? Originally it just meant young man, right? Yeoman, right? And it's still a class in the British Navy, right? You can still be a yeoman first class or yeoman whatever class, right? So, but originally it was basically young men who were perhaps not going to inherit from their fathers because maybe they were second or third son, and they became a professional military class. During the 100 Years' War, this class grew rapidly. Edward III, and then afterwards the Richards and Henrys and everybody, they needed these young men to populate their army, right? And young men actually came a little bit cheaper than well-seasoned nobles and whatnot. These were non-nobles half the time. These were definitely non-nobles, and they're hanging out with boys in the army of the Scots at Bannockburn. And so I'll just sort of point this one out. Yeomen and swannes and pittle, and men on foot, right? That in the park to yame vittle were left, who were in the rear to watch the supplies, you know, which are left for the army, right? When they wist but listen that their lordes with fell fecting on their fires assembled were, ane of themself that war there, captain of them, all they made, and shates of that war some del brad, they fasten it in stayed of banners upon lime trays and spears, and said that they would say the fact and help their lords at their might. So if we translate that a little bit, these guys who are left in sort of the rear of they're not armed all that well, right? They're just basically there to watch the supplies, but they see their noble lords like Bruce and Douglas going off and fighting, and they're like, I'm getting some of that. And so they actually get some spears, and they make their own banners and whatnot, and they elect a captain, and they all rush out. And when the English lords, we're going to find out, this is kind of funny, when the English lords, I mean, there's like 15,000 of them. And when the English lords who are out there fighting and the English footmen who are out there fighting see all of these crazed yeomen and boys and people on foot following the noble lords of Scotland into the battle, they shit themselves and run. Yeah, no, it's great. No, check it out. And this is well, it's not actually, I'm sorry, it's not actually in there. Y'all are laughing. But notice, I mean, you heard William Wallace's grandiose speech in Braveheart before the battle of Stirling. And, you know, freedom, fight for freedom, all that kind of crap. No, look at what these guys are saying. Slay, slay. Kill, kill. They're running upon them hastily. And the English people are like, oh, no, that's a good war cry. We're gonna. So, the Englishmen who had rushed through in force in the fight, as I said before, I'm reading the translation over here, when they saw coming with such a cry toward them, such a company which they thought as good as many were, that they had been fighting with them there, they had not seen before, then witching well, without much ado, they were so extremely terrified that the best and most hardy in their host that day wanted with their honor to have been away. They'd run away. So, no joke, when the English see these yeomen, these non-nobles who are part of the supply train, come at them with banners yelling, kill, 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 they run away. It's great. This is part of what makes the Scottish victory at Bannockburn possible. This is what makes the victory over Edward II's military possible, according to Barbour. It's not just that Bruce went out and clove someone's head in twain. It's also that he had the support of the people, the common people who were there. Now, that's important because a national identity can't just be based on the king. We've all watched Game of Thrones, right?
No.
What was his name? Joffrey? Who the hell liked Joffrey? What a wanker, right? Yeah, no, you think about it for a second. I mean, just because he says he's king and, oh, I'm king and awesome and everybody will do what I say, and then they're walking through the street in that one scene and they're throwing stuff at him and trying to rape his queen and stuff, and you're like, no, they really don't like you, actually. You know, so I would not base my national identity on that guy. Barbour wants you to not only base your national identity, if you're a Scot, on King Robert, who's awesome, by the way, but also on the common people. So that's an interesting sort of, it's a different sort of ideology than you get from other writers in the 14th century who focus mostly on noblemen. Now, it would be, it wouldn't be enough for me to make this argument if we were just talking about the commoners at Bannockburn. But a lot of the castles that King Robert takes in the lead up to the big battle at Bannockburn were actually taken by the contrivance, the techniques, the tactics, the skill, the knowledge of common people. And I'd like to point a few of these out as well. Notice I haven't even looked at these stupid notes. Why did I bring them? I'm not sure. So, Roxborough. I actually have a picture of this in here somewhere. Let's see if I can find it. Here it is. Well, I guess it's going to come up. Here we go. Roxborough. That's what's left of it today. As you can see, it's on a hill and there's water and whatnot. My mom and dad and I actually went to the borders of Scotland last summer, and we went around. I was actually really disappointed. Roxborough was a piece of, I mean, that's it. I'm like, dude, I read about this. It's like supposed to be this fantastic castle, and yeah, it got taken. And there it is. That's what it looks like now. But the best part about this was that Robert the Bruce's right-hand man, James Douglas, who was also a border lord, who was trying to win back his own property for having sided with Robert. He was trying to win back his home property from the English. He actually gets this guy named Sim of the Lead House. Now, I have no idea what a lead house is. I mean, is his house made out of lead? Or is this some sort of smithy of some sort, right? But with a name like Sim of the Lead House, that's not something like James Lord of Douglas or Robert the Bruce, King of Scotland and Protector of the... No, this is like a commoner kind of name. This is like, Sim the Miller kind of thing. So Sim of the Lead House, perhaps maybe he made pipes for plumbing or for irrigation or something like that. But interestingly enough, James Douglas knows that if they're going to take Roxborough, which is in the borders there, and a strategic location at the time, the borders were strategic. Think about it, between England and Scotland. If you want Scots to fight against the English, you got to kind of hold the border. And border loyalty switched back and forth depending on who won which castle and who came riding around whacking them or giving out handouts or something. So interestingly enough, James Douglas knows he's got to get a local. And he goes to Sim of the Lead House, and he set all of his wit to figure out how Roxborough, through subtlety. James Douglas is good with subtlety, right? I even like how it's spelled, subtlety, right? Cool. Or onycraft. Douglas, we're going to find out, is quite ruthless, but through onycraft, including subtlety, right? Might woman be. So how are they going to win Roxborough? Well, it goes to Sim of the Lead House, and he's described as a crafty man and a curious one. And curious probably meant something more like inventive. He had some ideas. He liked to think about things, that kind of thing. And so this guy actually comes up with the idea of these hempen ropes and rope ladders, right? That they're going to throw up. They got hooks on them, these ingenious hooks, and then they're going to climb up the side of the walls. Now, this works a whole lot better. Have y'all seen, okay, so we were watching Game of Thrones the other day, and when they're trying to take, what's the place, King's Landing, and they're putting ladders up, I'm like, just push the ladders over, that's stupid. And you've seen the Lord of the Rings movies, right? And the orcs are trying to get over, and they've at least got those little things that go like that. We'll just pick those up and then chuck them back, right? These work better. Sim of the Lead House comes up with these great hook ideas. Because once it's over, and you've got guys climbing up the rope ladders, try to pick that up. I mean, I guess you could if you had, some really, really strong person. So Sim of the Lead House actually comes up with this rope ladder idea with wooden steps on them. And once you get the hooks over the battlement, then you can start climbing up. It's brilliant, brilliant. You're not just going to push this over. You're not just going to lift it up and shove it off. And Barbour includes this guy's story. Now that's cool, right there. You get a commoner who's got an idea that helps James Douglas win Roxborough, and he gives him credit. It's not just that James Douglas did it. Now, you guys have probably heard that King Arthur won the Battle of Mount Baden by himself. He killed 960 men in one day. And you're like, bullshit. Right, that's the kind of history that you get a lot of times in the Middle Ages. You get, this king did this much, and he was awesome. No, this king employed lots of cool Scottish people with crafty ideas, like Sim of the Lead House. Now you've heard of Sim of the Lead House, you can go tell people, it wasn't just Bruce and Wallace, there was this guy named Sim. What a great guy, right? And I have no idea if we can trace, now this would be sort of the next step, if I do some more research on the borders. It'd be a nice idea to find out what happened to Sim of the Lead House after Bannockburn. Whether or not he went on to become a noble lord, or whether his family just remained as sort of, just border people, right? I mean, did they go on? I don't know anybody named Lead House now. I did meet a guy in a pub in Melrose who told me that he was married to a woman named Hall, and I thought, that's good. I knew my family was from around here somewhere, and I was hoping they were on this side of the border. There's several others. So that was the capture of Roxborough, and that was actually quite important, a strategic location there, sort of in the middle, in the borders there. But the capture of Edinburgh. Now, I know some of you guys have maybe actually been to Edinburgh, but this is a really imposing castle. I know I'm almost out of time. Don't worry, I'm almost done. Let's see if I can find a good picture of it. Oh, holy crap! Here you go. This is good. This is like from the car park, so you can kind of see even that would be a pain in the ass to get to. It's built on volcanic rock, so I mean that's pretty amazing. There's my dad looking up at it, like, and I asked him the question. I got my camera out and said, "Dad, how do you think you'd get up that?" And he's looking at me and going, "I wouldn't." Here's the main gate, and Mick was going to ask me which one of these was Bruce and which was Wallace, and I honestly don't know. I think that one's Wallace, and that one's Bruce because I think he's got the crown on, so that's kind of cool. But you'll notice whose shield, whose symbol is put over the gate there. His coat of arms, the lion rampant. That's what Bruce wore on his. And you'll also notice the wonderful motto, Nemo me lacessit impune. No one touches me without getting their ass kicked. Or if you want to do it in Scots, you just say, "Water ye me, beware of me." Right? So, but interestingly enough, Edinburgh Castle was also captured by the aid of a commoner named William Francis. How many of y'all have heard of William Francis before? See? And Barbour puts him right in there. Not only does he put him in there, this guy's named William Francis, he helps, and this is the best part about it, he knows how to get into Edinburgh Castle because he used to date a girl there whose father didn't like her like hanging out with this guy from the town, and so he would like climb in over this certain part. So they knew exactly the footholds and whatnot to climb up the walls to get in so that he could, anyway, and so they make it in. It's fantastic. It's fantastic. And the best part about it, following this, and this is, Barbour actually says, well, so this clears up an old story here. There was, in St. Margaret's Chapel, which is the oldest portion of the castle there at Edinburgh, there was a prophecy that it would be taken by somebody named Francis, and there you go. He says it proves it. He was just a commoner. They always thought that it was going to be taken by the French, but no, it was a guy named William Francis. So that's pretty cool. So back to the final thing, I wanted to show you at least the picture of me looking very contemplative. When Bruce dies, he wants his heart taken by Douglas to the Holy Land. And he didn't quite make it, but it did go on a pilgrimage of sorts, and it did get used as a holy hand grenade, and it did something, I guess. But the Scots actually reinterred it, and there actually is a heart in that. There actually is human matter in this. They looked. I don't know if they did DNA testing, but they definitely looked at it, and it actually says it's got a line from Barbour's poem, which echoes a line from their 13. Or from, I forget which date it is, 1320 or 1316 Declaration of Arbroath. I think it's 1320. The 6th of April, which was Tartan Day, by the way. Bruce is going to look it up for me. I've actually got it on the timeline somewhere I could tell you. But basically it says, freedom. Freedom is a noble thing. Freedom allows a man, and I'm sorry to the women, but that was what they used at the time, a man to have whatever he likes. And it actually even says a noble heart may have no ease if freedom fails. And so the Scots decided they would put, Bruce's heart in a special place at Melrose Abbey. And the best part about this is that Melrose Abbey, I took the best picture of the entire, let's see if I can find it. No, check that out. That's good. So it's obviously a ruined abbey at this point, but it's one of the most beautiful. And they have the Bruce's heart. They also have a dog up here playing bagpipes, but instead of a gargoyle, right? There's a little dog playing bagpipes. It's kind of cool. I'm looking at the clock, and it says it's 8 o'clock, and I'm supposed to stop. I could talk all night. I didn't even get to William Wallace. God. And I could have talked more about the Douglas, so if you want to ask questions, let me know.
So, yeah.
I guess my ultimate point of the whole thing is that in order to fashion a national identity, a lot of it is fictive, a lot of it is storytelling ability, and I think Barbour as much as Blind Harry and the folks who followed in that tradition, the Braveheart tradition, were just master storytellers. And they created a history for us which you wouldn't normally get just in a regular history book. They created a poetic history. Both Barbour's and Blind Harry's books are actually poetic. And that makes for better Hollywood films, but it also makes for better stuff for me to assign my students in medieval lit and medieval humanities classes. It's so much more enjoyable to read than some history books. Some students think history's boring. Well, not Scottish history. It's pretty fantastic. Yeah, Mick.
So,
He's going to try to trip me up.
no, it's just that the Bruce spent 2, maybe 3 years in Saint Denis, which
Barbour did.
Yeah. And we're talking like what? That's the red light district.
Well,
And so are we
no. Pause for a second. It may be now, but there's the church there, which was founded by Abbot Suger. It was the first Gothic cathedral in Europe, and it was the first one to be actually called Gothic because it was a monstrosity to other people. They looked at it and said, "Look at that shit!" Right? It doesn't have round arches and stuff. It's all pointy and spiky, and then look at all. But once they walked inside, they were like, "Holy crap! Check out all of the stained glass that Suger is able to get in there." So this was a center of learning at that time period. It was on par with places like Bologna, Wittenberg, Oxford. So this would have been a great place for a Scot who knows French to actually go and look at some of the French histories. Because the French were fighting against the English. He wants to know as much about the English as he can for his poem. So he goes to Saint Denis, which was a center of learning. Yeah, Bob.
Just a little item of trivia. The owner of the bar here, his last name is Urquhart.
Hey, yeah, good. That's a good Scottish name. Absolutely. Yeah. I actually had someone at one point whose name was Turnbull, and I said, "Oh, that's a good Scottish name." And it was a little girl. I forget what she was saying. She said, "How did you know that?" And I said, "Oh, I studied that stuff." Yeah, and because they've got their own tartan that's registered, right? In about 1914. Oh, no, 18. Sorry, I think Mick had a follow-up. Did you have
Actually, no. It seems to me that Chaucer makes reference to Saint Denis and prostitution there, and thus the question.
Yeah, no. Barbour probably indulged in all of that too. Yeah. He was a church man, so yeah. And an educator. Back at the bar, yeah.
Got just 2 quick ones. I was wondering in your research back in the 1300s, did whiskey have anything to do with the creation of the stories?
Wouldn't that be awesome if we could tell that? Yeah.
I guess I can assume that was.
Yeah.
The other one is that when the Pythons are referring to Bruce, it's the same Bruce in their skits and whatnot?
I'm not exactly sure which skits. If you're talking about
I watched a lot of their stuff.
Yeah.
I pop up every once in a while, and I wonder if it's the same.
They love making fun of the Scots, and rightfully so, right? I mean, how could a Scot win Wimbledon? Well, if the Blancmange took over the world, right, kind of thing. That's the only way a Scot would actually win Wimbledon. But yeah, I'm not sure. I don't know the skit in which they talk about Bruce, but that would be an interesting one if they're talking about the same Robert the Bruce.
Yeah, I don't know. That was
historical.
the things I was.
In terms of whiskey, I'm not sure how much distilling they were doing back then. I don't think they were. They would have been drinking things more like mead. They would have been drinking ale. And the Scots, of course, didn't have as many hops as the English might have had, so they were drinking good beer, like Stone's Throw, that's not overly hoppy. Hops just taste like back rub to me, I'm sorry. but from the time I started actually drinking, when I was not old enough, but when the time I started appreciating beer, it was non-hoppy Scottish types of beer, and I've just never looked back. So the hops can go boil themselves somewhere else, right? Yeah.
You mentioned upon the publication of this book in the 1300s that something was considered a romance. They actually had classifications that far back.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, okay. So Barbour actually mentions other romances in his romance, and all of them are essentially fictional. But then again, the line between what was considered fictional and historical in the Middle Ages was sometimes shady. So, for instance, the siege of Rome, the siege of Jerusalem, that's a romance, and you think that's a violent, bloody thing. Anyway, but because it was poetic and it was written in sort of Anglo-Norman or Anglo, there was a genre there. Barbour is actually considering this a romance about Bruce rather than a chronicle. First off, because he wrote it in poetry, and second off, because it involves a hero and a happy ending. And I think he's also probably trying to distinguish it from actual just history books, chronicle books. He had a colleague at Aberdeen, John Forden, who wrote straight up history, right? And I think Barbour is maybe trying to distinguish himself. So that, if you hear about Barbour's romance of the Bruce, or the Bruce as a romance, you're more inclined to want to read it. It's going to be more entertaining than his colleague John Forden's plain old history. That's just plain old history. This is going to be better. I think he's also able to take license when he's writing a romance. He's also able to include all of these folkloric types of stories that he's heard from people. He's got tons and tons of probably oral informants who he would have been acquainted with, who would have been either the descendants or people who had actually fought with Bruce and Douglas. So Barbour is actually using the romance genre in order to incorporate all these exciting stories rather than just straight up history. Even Blind Harry, when he says, he actually says, I'm not writing a chronicle. And with Blind Harry, he makes up more shit than Barbour did. So if you're looking for a real romance, go read the William Wallace story, because he makes a ton of stuff up. Blind Harry, by the way, in the 15th century, was the first to have Bruce and Wallace meet at the Battle of Falkirk. And the Wallace converts the Bruce to the Scottish national cause. Wallace says to Bruce, "Why are you fighting against your own people?" And he calls him a devourer of his own blood. And Bruce is like, "No, come on, dude, join me. Man, we can kick ass." And he's like, "No. And so Bruce goes back to the English camp and he sits down. Now, this isn't Blind Harry's version, not Barbour's version, right? Barbour would have never said anything nasty about Bruce like this. Bruce sits down to eat with the other English lords at Edward I's table, and he hasn't washed his hands. No, they've been fighting all day, right? So you've seen the movies, they got blood all over him. He sits down to eat, and one of the English lords says, "Look, behold, yon Scot eats his own blood." And Bruce looks down and is like, "Oh shit, I am kind of eating my own blood. I've been killing Scottish people all day long." And so he goes back to Wallace the next day and says, "I'm sorry, I'll never fight for England again." Guess what? Mel Gibson and what's his name, Randall Wallace, who wrote the story that Braveheart was based on, they capitalized on that. 6 Ways to Sunday. Never happened. If anybody talked to William Wallace, who was named Bruce, it would have been Bruce's father at that battle. So. But anyway, that was a big fiction. What else you got?
So the Bruce killed Henry de Bohun.
Yeah.
The only known patron of medieval alliterative literature.
This would have been earlier. That would have been a descendant of this Henry de Bohun. Yeah, because you're thinking a bit later in the 14th century.
I don't believe so. Give me do you have that? That's the question. Do you
No.
have a date on this?
Yeah. Check out the. I'll pull up your timeline again. But this Bannock Burn was like 13, 14. So.
Oh, that is earlier.
Yeah, it's earlier than the Boone that you're talking about.
Okay, very good.
So. Yeah.
Your sins are forgiven. Is all I'm saying.
Yeah, the Boones were a big family, so it wasn't, and lots of them were named Henry.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, we were actually in class the other day.
I was getting a little uptight here.
No. We were looking at some of the Knights of the Garter, because you go online, you can find the whole list from the founding all the way down, and of course the Earls of Stafford. There's like every other one of them's named John of Stafford. John was like, is this the same guy just getting reincarnated? No. So the same way with Henry de Bohun, right? Yeah, this was not the same one. But you recognize the name.
Well, yeah.
And that tells you something right there. Barbour knows that you're going to recognize this as a prominent noble family. And the fact that Bruce can stand up in his stirrups and kind of go, right? Great, perfect. One of the things that I didn't get to talk about, and I could continue talking about this all night, but one of the things that made it possible for the victory of Bannockburn was not just that Bruce was awesome, and it was not just that the yeomen and the boys and the foot soldiers joined in. It was the fact that, I mean, if you look at the date, we're talking 1314, the Great Famine was going on in England. People were dying left, right, and center. There were cattle disease. Cows were dying left, right, and all that. Half of Edward II's army. Now, Edward II was totally incompetent, right? So there's another. And half of his army was dying of dysentery on the way. There was a plague. I mean, you just start to think about it. England didn't really stand a chance. But here's something that's quite telling. One of the bits of advice that Edward II got from one of his advisors was to wait a few years, quit attacking the Scots after this terrible defeat. Just wait 5-10 years, and all the yeomen who were fighting with Bruce in the Scottish National Army would go back to farming rather than fighting. And then they would have a chance. Their swords would get rusty, and they would have a chance. Well, guess what happened? I mean, if you look at the history, after Robert I dies, Scotland does appear to be independent, but David the first, he gets kidnapped. He's crowned, but he gets kidnapped, and eventually you get James the First, and he stays a prisoner pretty much until he's of marrying age in the Tower of London. So even though Scotland's independent, their kings are being kidnapped left and right and put in the Tower of London. They're not really ruling a whole lot. So Scotland was being ruled by the Stuarts, and the Douglases. And the Douglases and Stuarts eventually butt heads. And the Douglases are outlawed, and they try to exterminate them. That's a whole nother chapter in the book, but the Douglases were fan-freaking-tastic. I love them to the point where they posed such a threat to the crown that they were eliminated. The Black Douglas. And their castle, oh my God, one of them, Threave Castle. It stands on an island in the river. It's just gorgeous. It's still mean looking today. Anyway, I can keep talking, but more questions, please. Yeah.
Admittedly, most of my Scottish history is based on Braveheart.
Yay.
In the movie, they have Robert the Bruce's dad. He looks like he's dying of leprosy.
Yeah.
And
so they got one of them.
Yeah.
Leprosy. That was
so
fine.
that was interesting that it actually was the Bruce. But he is propping his son up, the Bruce, who seems like this reluctant leader at the time.
Yeah.
Is any of that?
No. Once again, that's based on Randall Wallace's version, which is loosely, but not quite so loosely based on Blind Harry's version. Right? But yeah, the leper father Bruce putting his kid into trying to tell him how to behave politically and support this guy and don't support. Yeah. That's all made up. That's all kind of modern. Yeah. The Bruces did fight with Edward I. They fought for the English until Robert Robert the Bruce realized that he could actually make a go of it. And really, what happened was when he killed Comyn, that was the end of it. He had to make a go of it. He had to actually try to become King of Scotland. What other questions you got? Yeah, Randy.
I like, your focus on how it included a lot of the commoners actually in it. And I was just wondering, obviously they weren't the ones who were going to pay him to do it.
Right.
And so was there any reasoning that you found in your research, to want to maybe restore nostalgia of commoners and royalty coming together? Or?
Whether Barbour intended it or not, I think the fact that he includes so many non-written sources, but these oral sources and these sources that might have come from common people, it warmed my heart. But maybe he was just trying to get as many sources as possible to make his story as accurate and as entertaining as possible. And whether he had the idea that he was creating a new kind of Scottish identity based on not just the royal, but also the common people. I don't know if he I want to believe that he did. I want to believe that Barbour was trying to do something like that, to say that a nation is not just a king. A nation is also the people, and check out some of those people, right? So it could have just been that he was so meticulous and he took great notes, and so he went around interviewing people. Oh, so your dad fought with Bruce? I'll take that, right? But yeah, so that's a good question. I mean, did he intend to do that, or did he just collect a whole bunch of sources and that's what he had? I don't know. I want to believe that he really wanted to include common people. I want to believe that. That's me. Because I'm a common person. Mary, did you have your hand up? Who else? Oh, yeah.
It's kind of in line with Randy's question.
Yeah.
Being this is so uncommon, include the common people. Do we have any sense of how it was received by people who read it?
Yeah. We do know that Barbour's portrait of James Douglas became kind of part of common folklore. So that women, when little kids would misbehave, they would say, "The Black Douglas topped ya." So, and the little kids would like crap themselves and run, right? Because they had maybe heard the story, or at least heard some version of the story. James Douglas, I wanted to focus on him as well, but he was brutal. I mean, he didn't get the nickname Black for no reason. He was mean. He was good to his own people, but man, if you got on the wrong side of him. So when he retook his own castle, he knew he couldn't hold it, that he had to go and capture other castles. So they completely spoiled the well by killing people and horses and throwing them down the well. Yeah, I know it's terrible. Horses were harmed in the making of this war. Animals were down here. But there was also, they just destroyed everything. They made this nasty-ass pile of blood and guts and meal, and they call it the Douglas's larder. And the Douglas's, I mean, if you've made a complete mess of it, Mick calls this a dog's breakfast. But in Scotland, they would call it a Douglas larder. You've made the Douglas larder of that. And so, yeah. But yeah, I had a whole chapter focusing on the Douglases in the book because they're just so fascinating. And then they failed. They challenged too much, they got too powerful, and then they got taken out. So it was kind of sad. Any other questions? How long did the questions go on for?
Until now.
Oh, until now? Okay. Well, I want to thank y'all for coming out and listening. I want to thank